Welcome, and thank you for joining Energy Dialogues for the next installment of the Energy Dialogues University Connect podcast. This podcast highlights intergenerational conversations about potential concerns the younger generation has when it comes to energy, opportunities to join the workforce in the sector, and why this is such a great time to do so. We also give insight into a day in the life of executives in the energy industry, offering a unique snapshot at the peak of their career. Prepare for frank conversations between the generations, discussing the opportunities and challenges of energy and its critical need to recruit the leaders of tomorrow. You will gain valuable career advice, as well as learn lessons from some of the leading minds in the business. We are at a pivotal moment now, with the energy industry experiencing ongoing change, and there has never been a better time to join a sector that focuses on solutions for human development and energy access globally. This podcast will address concerns, encourage and enlighten the rising stars of the new generation, and share how our network of prestigious leaders got to where they are today. And now, I'd like to hand it over to Hope Pratt, co-founder of the Energy Dialogue sponsored organization Energy Terminal, who will be speaking with Rob Jennings, Vice President, Natural Gas Markets at American Petroleum Institute. Hope?
Thank you, Benna. Hi, Rob. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Hope. Happy to be here.
This is great. So we're going to talk a lot about what the American Petroleum Institute is doing and your role there. But before we dive into that, can you just tell us what the American Petroleum Institute is and what's API's purpose within the U.S. energy sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So the American Petroleum Institute is what's called a trade association. So we represent a specific industry. In our case, API is the largest trade association that represents the full value chain of U.S. oil and natural gas companies. So everything from upstream production to midstream transportation to downstream refining, and of course now LNG exports, which has been a growing subsector within oil and gas. And really our job is to be the eyes and ears, but also the voice of the oil and gas industry here in Washington. So we do lobbying, we engage with all of the various executive agencies around town here, and really just make sure that our industry's interests are heard.
Awesome. So before we learn more about what you specifically do as the VP of Natural Gas, let's first talk about your previous experience. So previous to API, you worked in power and gas market consulting. What skills or lessons from this experience have proven essential in your current role?
Yeah, it's interesting. I took somewhat of a unique path here. I think most people at API generally came from either a regulatory agency or from working on Capitol Hill. There aren't too many of us that came from the consulting world, but I really found that consulting, especially in power and gas market space, provided me a really good base for going forward. You really have to understand, especially when it comes to energy, to oil and gas, you have to understand the market, supply demand fundamentals. And that's what energy consulting gives you, is it really drills that into your head. It kind of allows you to pivot from there. Some folks stay in the market, but I preferred to get into the policy world, and that's how I landed at API.
And what specifically about policy drove you to it?
I think, I really wanted to influence something. I think oil and gas has always been a passion of mine. I think it's one of the great industries that we have here in the U.S. And I really enjoyed my time in consulting. But I think you'd have to sweat pretty hard to say that you're actually influencing anything in that world. But when you work at API and you're engaging with the executive branch and with members of Congress on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, you really do feel like you're making a difference here and getting the best outcomes for the industry.
That makes total sense. Okay, so let's transition into talking about natural gas. It's often called a bridge fuel. How do you, as the VP of Natural Gas at API, see its role evolving in the context of decarbonization and energy security within the US?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the phrase bridge fuel was starting to be used when I first entered the industry around 2011, and it was everywhere. It was, hey, this is what we need. Back then we were getting more than half of our electricity from coal. Renewables were just over the horizon, and natural gas was just a short-term bridge to get us there. That was 14 years ago, and demand for natural gas has grown year in and year out in the power sector and the industrial sector, et cetera. And I think by now we've proven that it's here to stay. That natural gas is not just a short-term bridge fuel, but really a key pillar of American energy security, and a good basis for the progress we've made on the industrial side. So But at the same time, it has contributed to the largest reduction in carbon emissions of any country in the world. So carbon emissions are down at the U.S. level by about 1 billion tons per year since 2008, 2007, 2008, and that's more than any other country in the world. And most of that shift has just been from the switch from coal to natural gas. You can get a 40 or 50% reduction in carbon intensity of, say, power generation by switching from coal to natural gas. So we really do see it as a long-term part of the solution for the energy transition.
That makes total sense. Something that I know Energy Dialogues talks a lot about is all of the above solutions. So natural gas should definitely be in the conversation. So the US is a global LNG exporter. How do you think this has shaped international energy relationships?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting going back to that same time period in 2008. Everyone pretty much in the world thought that the US was on the cusp of becoming the largest importer of LNG because our gas production, oil and gas production, were both kind of flatlining. But then shale happened very quickly. And over the next decade, we became both the largest producer of natural gas and the largest exporter of LNG. And that's really changed the way we view the world. I think if you think back to 2022, when the tragic Russian invasion of Ukraine, that was followed by the cutoff of pipeline gas from Russia into Europe, the value of LNG really became clear to a lot of people who maybe hadn't thought about it previously. And I think our ability to help our allies in Europe get through that crisis and stave off the worst of what really could have been an economic catastrophe speaks to the value of LNG, and it really has broadened the energy relationships that we have. And for what it's worth, it's also allowed us to do energy diplomacy. It's an important tool in diplomatic negotiations with countries, allies, and non-allies around the world. And then I guess the final point here, I think the final important thing that LNG does is that it prevents us from being overly reliant on countries that may not have our best interests at heart or whose values are not aligned with ours.
Definitely, I think energy security is a really important highlight of our ability to export LNG. It also means that we have quite a quantity for ourselves to consume. So when we're talking about exporting, what regions do you find are most interesting to watch when it comes to LNG demand and infrastructure development? I know we talked about Europe, but outside of Europe.
Yeah, I think going forward, most people would tell you that Asia is going to be the growth market. You've got growing populations there first and foremost. You've got a growing middle class, a growing industrial base, and so we really view that as the area to watch when it comes to growing demand for U.S. LNG. At the same time, I mean, you've got to have long-term contracts signed. I mean, that's the gold standard for getting these projects off the ground is having enough long-term contracts. So we know that our member companies are going to these countries and leveraging the relationships they have to get those deals signed so that we can get more and more export terminals here in the U.S. off the ground.
That makes total sense. That's interesting. That'll be cool to see how that plays out in the next coming years. So we just talked about a lot of positives of natural gas in terms of decarbonization and energy security for the US. But there's many critics on this fuel. They argue that natural gas investment delays the shift to renewables. How do you respond to critics who say this? What's API and your own personal thoughts on this issue?
I think we don't have to view things as a zero-sum game. That renewables are really going to be in the power sector mainly, whereas natural gas, we like to refer to it as a Swiss Army knife because you can use it just about anywhere in the power sector. It heats homes, people cook with it. It goes to the industrial sector. We make, petrochemical facilities that make plastics and fertilizer and the things that we rely on day in and day out. So we really don't view it as an or proposition, but as an and proposition. Again, you mentioned the all of the above strategy. API is an all of the above organization. And we really do believe that there's a place for all technology types out there. And for what it's worth, we have member companies who are investing in things like offshore wind, several member companies, oil and gas companies who have diversified their own investments because they are truly all of the above, truly all of the above solution as well.
And that's something I know in your bio, it mentions that you're interested in emerging technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration, which I think relate to this all of the above approach. How has API's position on emerging technologies and decarbonization shifted over time, and what factors have influenced that shift? I know many years back it was less publicly it seemed less open to different technologies outside of natural gas and oil as compared to now.
Yeah, I mean, if you think in our simplest form, we represent the members of our interests, and so the members of our interests have changed over time. Our members are making big investments in things like hydrogen, so low carbon hydrogen and carbon capture, especially. Those are two big ones that we really think are critical to meeting what we know is growing demand for energy, but also increasing or continuing to drive down emissions over time. And the thing is, you can use both of those technologies to drive down emissions from the natural gas industry. So that's really where we've landed. And again, we have to follow kind of where our members are going, but we haven't seen kind of a decrease in appetite for investments in emerging technologies, kind of regardless of we view it as really transcending presidential administrations. Our industry makes long-term investments, 20-year investments, so we can't think in election cycles. And we've really seen a big push as part of this budget reconciliation bill that just passed the House last week and is heading towards the Senate now. Is we've been very much activated on maintaining the tax credits that were first put out in the Inflation Reduction Act almost 3 years ago. So our commitment to those low carbon technologies hasn't changed.
That makes total sense that, energy companies have been changing over time, so you guys have to as well. Um, so let's talk about the difference between policymakers and industry leaders. There's many points of tension between these two. What's kind of driving those differences, and what are those points of tension?
Yeah, so we welcome what we view as a more pro-American energy administration and majorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate that we have today. We faced a lot of challenges over the past 4 years that have gone away, and we appreciate the administration pulling back on a few things that we just thought were misguided, less things like the tailpipe rule, which was essentially an electric vehicle mandate, and the methane fee, which is just duplicative. But that said, we do have probably some differences with the current administration and the current folks in power here in Washington. I think the biggest example of that is trade. We fully recognize the administration's desire to rebalance some of the trade relationships that we have around the world, but we think energy is an example of trade policy that works really well, especially what we call the North American energy relationship. We import a special kind of crude oil at a discount from Canada, and it feeds our Midwest refinery that are owned by our member companies. So we've tried to be very clear with the administration and folks on the Hill that we really value the free trade of energy and energy products specifically.
That makes total sense. And when you're having these conversations with policymakers, it's probably different for you because you're closer to them. But I know something that we've experienced at Energy Dialogues events is that it can be a little polarizing if you're talking to someone who's such a different view on something than you. So how do you approach these conversations to kind of get API's viewpoints out there in a way that's not polarizing any of the people you're trying to convince?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things we do here is education. It's a big part of what our policy division focuses on is just making sure that the truth about the benefits of oil and natural gas, especially U.S. oil and natural gas, are well understood. We talked a few minutes ago about how the switch from coal to natural gas has been the single biggest driver of carbon emissions reductions of any country in the world over the past 15 years or 20 years now, since 2005. And we just want to make sure that folks understand that there's still more room to go there. We've got a lot of latent emissions reductions out there because we still burn 500 million tons of coal per year. So things like that, I think, are really helpful. And we also talk about, of course, the economic impact, because even if folks don't necessarily share our views on oil and natural gas, I mean, these people do represent districts and states that need jobs and need economic activity. And our industry brings that in spades. We support over 11 million jobs and 8% of US GDP. So that type of education, I think, can really help us break down some of the barriers that might otherwise exist.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for explaining that. I feel like that's one of the daunting things about the energy transition
Yeah.
is this gap of education and also gap of understanding between
Yep.
people. So it's interesting to see how you guys approach that, but it makes a lot of sense why that's a successful approach. Okay, so before we close out here, you have a really impressive career, many years in power and market and energy consulting, and now you're at API doing a lot of amazing work. So how can a student set themselves up to, like you, have a big impact on the energy transition? What are some steps that they can take today?
One of the things that I feel like I have benefited from is that I've worked across the markets and the policy space. I think looking forward, I mean, we've got growing demand for energy, and we very much have a reshuffling of the global order here. The places that used to supply energy aren't supplying as much energy anymore. Places that used to be big demand centers are now supplying energy. So I think having a grasp on both the market side and the policy side really set me up for success. Because in this changing order, you really have got to understand what is how markets influence policy, and especially when it comes to a global market like oil, like that for oil and natural gas. You really, policy making cannot be done in a vacuum. You really have to understand how trade flows happen, how energy flows happen. Otherwise, you risk putting in place policies that just won't work and disrupt markets, like we've seen in Europe over the last decade or so. So I think really focusing on investing in both the knowledge in markets and knowledge around policy is a good path to take.
Great. That makes so much sense. Well, thank you so much, Rob. This is awesome. I think our audience is going to learn a lot. And I enjoyed learning more about the American Petroleum Institute myself. Thank you.
No, thank you, Hope. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me, and hope to see you guys again soon.
Definitely.